I remember that afternoon with the kind of precision only distance and habit allow. The sun had slipped behind a low, brooding bank of clouds, casting the quads in a grey-amber light, as though the stone itself were tired of the day. Leaves skittered across the cobbles, stirred by a wind that smelled faintly of wet paper and old ivy. I wandered through the grounds of one college after another, noting the way the rain had left its streaks on the ancient windows, the subtle scuff on the library door that suggested some hurried visitor, and the lonely bicycle propped against the wall, its basket slightly askew. Small details, perhaps insignificant to anyone else, but they settled in my mind like a soft prelude, hinting at rhythms and absences. The bells tolled in the distance, counting hours in a cadence both comforting and cruel. I always think of them as a reminder that time moves on, indifferent to our curiosities and errors. Passing a particularly empty quad, I noticed the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from a chimney, and the way a single stone had shifted underfoot, betraying some unnoticed movement. One could imagine the kind of conversation that had taken place there, voices hushed and weighted with unspoken grievance. I tried to follow the pattern, though patterns are rarely so obliging. It was there that a letter arrived, left on my flat's doormat, its edges curling with damp. The envelope carried no sender, only the precise lettering that suggested the care of someone practiced in these small deceptions. Inside, the note was brief, meticulously polite and disturbingly vague. A missing fellow, a concern that words could not fully capture. I did not yet know Dr. Adrian Coleridge's name, nor the shape of the absence that would soon dominate my thoughts. But the words lingered, insistent in their quiet urgency. It was enough to tilt a day, to make ordinary steps feel like a slow approach toward a shadow. I paused at the iron gates of another college, watching the wind lift leaves in a brief, chaotic spiral. It reminded me of certain classical verses, the way an image can float above comprehension before settling into memory, like the lines of a poem one half reads in a library, never fully grasped, but lodged in consciousness. I recalled a misquoted line from Milton in some old lecture, the misplacement of one word altering intent entirely, and the way a scholar might hesitate, embarrassed, before correcting a friend. Such hesitations are rarely meaningless. The quads were nearly deserted, except for the distant figure of a porter shuffling papers, the faint creak of a door on its hinges, the occasional caw of a crow that seemed to punctuate the silence rather than disturb it. I moved slowly, measuring each step not out of caution, but in alignment with the city's muted rhythm, the way one might attend to the faintest variations in a sonata, observing, waiting, feeling the subtle press of history in the stone and the wind. By the time I returned to my rooms, the letter had imprinted itself across my thoughts. It was a quiet summons, a whisper of what was to come, and I allowed myself to notice the melancholy that often follows such invitations, the sense of inevitability, and the faint ache that comes from recognizing one's own curiosity as both tool and liability. Outside, the afternoon waned toward evening, and the bells continued to mark the hours, indifferent to the unfolding of human concern. And in that gentle melancholy, I began to think, as always, of what might be overlooked in the spaces between sound and shadow. The morning after the letter arrived, I found myself walking toward the registrar's office, the drizzle of an early Oxford rain soaking my coat and darkening the stones beneath my feet. The city seemed to shrink under the grey sky, as if the architecture itself were leaning in to hear secrets better spoken softly. It was the kind of morning that invites introspection, the quiet moments between one bell and the next. I had not yet met Dr. Adrian Coleridge, the absent fellow whose name would soon become tethered to every thought I allowed myself. But the letter carried the weight of urgency, and urgency is rarely polite. At the registrar's office, the air smelled faintly of ink and damp ledger pages. The assistant greeted me with a nod, eyes wary, as though my presence might unsettle some hidden order. I inquired about Dr. Coleridge's whereabouts, and the assistant produced a succinct note from the master of the college. Dr. Coleridge had failed to appear for a morning lecture, and no one had seen him since the previous evening. An absent scholar is rarely alarming on its own. Oxford is full of eccentric absences and errant habits. Yet the combination of the letter, the untimely disappearance, and a subtle anxiety in the registrar's voice suggested a circumstance that deserved attention beyond polite conjecture. I began with the obvious details. Coleridge had lectures in the classical faculty. Known for his meticulous habit of arriving early to arrange the room, ensure the blackboard was clean, and check his notes. It seemed improbable that he would miss this routine without cause. I asked about his associates, his students, and those who had dined with him the previous evening. Faces flickered in my mind. A student who lingered too long over a crossword puzzle, a fellow whose smile seemed rehearsed, the porter who always spoke in measured, slightly curt tones. Small gestures, perhaps meaningless, yet each one is a potential key if observed with patience. I returned briefly to my rooms to consider these impressions, setting the envelope beside a half-filled crossword. The clue I had paused on the night before, a hidden truth often disguised in plain sight, now seemed curiously apt. Coleridge had been fond of such literary conceits, embedding layers of meaning in otherwise ordinary lectures. I wondered if his disappearance might mirror that subtlety, a riddle played out across the mundane architecture of his life. The thought prompted me to scan the ledger again, to note entries that seemed ordinary, but bore the faint echo of hesitation or correction. At midday, I wandered the quads, retracing likely routes, observing each doorway and window as though they might speak if pressed correctly. The air carried the scent of damp stone and faint traces of tobacco from early risers. I noticed a misaligned chair outside a lecture hall, its position suggesting someone had left abruptly. A smudge on the windowsill hinted at the weight of a hand, and a faint ink stain on the ledge near the library entrance suggested Coleridge had perhaps paused there, writing or consulting notes. Small details, perhaps trivial, yet together they traced a pattern that, if followed, might illuminate more than mere absence. By late afternoon, I had compiled a series of minor inconsistencies: the timing of the porter's rounds, the route favored by Coleridge when returning from lectures, and the unusually careful phrasing of the registrar's note. None spoke clearly of danger, yet each carried the subtle tension of unspoken knowledge. Lewis, when I called, remarked that I was becoming too absorbed in minutiae, but I knew that Oxford often concealed its truths in such minutiae, in the quiet gestures that the unobservant overlook. As the sun fell behind another bank of clouds, I lingered in the empty quad, listening to the muted echo of my own footsteps. The missing fellow was more than a name on a page. He was a presence that had been evacuated, leaving traces of intention, anxiety, and perhaps even fear. And in those traces, I felt the first faint flicker of understanding, a puzzle whose pieces would only begin to coalesce when examined with patience, restraint, and a willingness to read between the shadows. The following morning, I found myself wandering the quiet quad of St. Edmund's, the dew still clinging to the stone, glinting faintly in a reluctant sun. The world was washed in pale light, the kind that sharpens edges and casts shadows in unexpected corners. I moved slowly, as though the pace of my steps might coax meaning from the absence I was tracing. Each leaf that trembled against the cobbles seemed to whisper of something unnoticed, each discarded scrap of paper an echo of human preoccupation. I had begun to understand that the absence of Dr. Coleridge left more than silence. It left a faint, deliberate pattern that the observant might follow. It was there, beside a worn bench beneath an ancient elm, that I noticed the first of what would become the central thread, a small inscription carved lightly into the armrest. At first, it appeared a trivial string of letters, almost meaningless, but the rhythm of the engraving struck me. The letters corresponded to a line from Horace, misquoted, missing a syllable that would otherwise clarify intent. My mind, accustomed to the eccentricities of Oxford scholars, recognized the deliberate omission. A misquote is rarely careless, especially when carved with care into the wood, and I allowed the realization to settle slowly, letting it pulse beneath the surface of thought. I crouched to examine the surrounding area more closely. A smear of mud on the paving stones suggested hurried movement. Perhaps someone had paused here in passing, tracing the path of anxiety more than the path of leisure. A bent corner of a sheet of paper had lodged itself beneath a cobblestone. I retrieved it carefully, noting the faint scent of tobacco and the indentation of writing, as though someone had pressed thoughts into it before abandoning the page. It seemed, even in its incompleteness, to carry a rhythm akin to a heartbeat interrupted, tentative, conscious of observation. While leaning over the stone, I became aware of movement across the quad porter adjusting a sign, a student fumbling with a camera, a scholar pausing to recite aloud to no one in particular. Each gesture seemed benign, yet in the mind of a detective, benign gestures are rarely innocent. I noticed that the student's gaze lingered a fraction too long on the bench. The scholar's cadence skipped a line where the poetry demanded it, and the porter, glancing back, offered a slight tilt of the head that suggested something known yet unspoken. Small fissures in behavior, subtle as a whisper, often illuminate far more than forceful admissions. By the time I rose from the bench, I had mapped a constellation of minor details. The misquoted line, the discarded paper, the faint mud smudge, the hesitant glances. They coalesced into a pattern that was more impression than proof, more intuition than certainty. I made a note in my mind to revisit the college ledger, to compare lecture schedules with these subtle movements, to see whether the absence of Coleridge was mirrored elsewhere in the routines of those around him. Oxford is a city of echoes, and the faintest resonance often carries the truth. I paused for a moment beneath the elm, allowing the silence to fill the space between observation and conjecture. A crow circled overhead, its wings casting moving shadows across the cobbles, and the bells chimed somewhere distant, punctuating the morning with a melancholy clarity. I realized that the clue was not merely a message, nor merely a misquote. It was a signpost, a pivot of attention that demanded patience and attention, qualities the absent Coleridge had exercised with near obsessive precision. The day had begun to unfold a narrative in whispers, one that required listening rather than declaration. As I left the quad, the faint impression of the inscription lingered in my mind, the echo of the paper's indentation pressing gently against memory. It was the kind of detail that could easily be dismissed, yet I knew that in the spaces between stones and leaves, between gesture and hesitation, lay the first true intimations of motive and opportunity. The missing fellow had left traces, not declarations, and it was in tracing these traces with care, in listening to the quiet cadence of a city steeped in scholarship, that the next steps of understanding began to emerge. It arrived just after midday, slipped beneath the door of my room with the quietude of a careful observer. The envelope was pale, edged with a faint curl from damp, and bore no name, only the precise flourish of someone who had practiced restraint. I recognized immediately the weight of intention in such things. Anonymity is seldom careless in Oxford. I placed it beside the half-finished crossword on the table and studied the faint impression of writing through the paper, the way one might examine a pressed leaf or a frayed bookmark for hidden marks. Every detail mattered, for even absence can speak with eloquence. The letter inside was brief, economical, yet insistent. Lines of text folded with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to scholarship, a missing colleague, a sense of peril, references that danced lightly on the edge of classical allusion. Shelley and Milton were invoked, their words skewed just enough to suggest knowledge without revelation. The phrasing suggested a mind both erudite and anxious, aware of observation and yet daring to whisper. It was a call, muted but urgent, and I allowed it to settle into the slow rhythm of thought. I reread it twice, letting each line breathe in the mind as though inhaled rather than read. Certain letters bore unusual pressure, the pen hesitating or pressing deliberately. The syntax carried subtle emphasis that might betray intent. The writer was careful, but not careful enough to conceal entirely. I traced my finger along a faint crease and thought of the last few days. The misaligned chair in the quad, the smudge on the windowsill, the inscription carved into the elm bench. Each was a minor pulse in a larger rhythm that the letter seemed to underscore, a sequence both deliberate and fleeting. Curiosity drew me to the library, though the rain had begun in earnest, tapping a staccato against the leaded windows. I considered the letter alongside the catalogue of Coleridge's recent lectures, noting topics of classical strategy and rhetorical subtlety. He had been fond of literary riddles, of embedding meaning beneath the ordinary, and I allowed myself to suspect that his disappearance might follow the same logic. There is a peculiar intimacy in examining absence, and in tracing the deliberate hesitations of another, one begins to recognize the faint fingerprint of anxiety as it is impressed upon ordinary objects. I returned to my room and considered the envelope once more, allowing the room's dim light to illuminate its curves. The crossword puzzle lay open, the clue from the previous night's truth veiled in shadow, taking on a resonance I had not fully appreciated. The anonymous letter, in its restraint, was not merely a report or warning. It was a puzzle. A literary device designed to provoke attention without offering closure. It suggested presence through absence, a pattern I would need to unravel delicately. By the afternoon, the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, and the city itself seemed to lean into reflection, the cobbles dark and glistening, the spires half concealed by mist. I found myself thinking of small gestures in the letter, the unusual word choice, the hesitation in the pen, the classical quotations slightly askew. Each was a thread, and I began to sketch their connections in my mind rather than on paper, recognizing the subtle architecture beneath their surface. Oxford has a way of concealing urgency in the ordinary, of allowing the trivial to carry portent, and I knew that in attending to these subtleties, the path forward would gradually clarify. The bells tolled somewhere distant, indifferent to the letter or the absence it mourned. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, inhaling the faint scent of wet stone and ink, and understood that the day's investigation had begun in earnest. The anonymous note had spoken, quietly and insistently, and it would guide my attention toward overlooked details, toward minor gestures, toward the cast not by action, but by suggestion. In that soft insistence, I felt the faint stirrings of a pattern, one that would demand patience, observation, and the kind of restraint Oxford teaches better than any lecture. I arrived at St. Edmund's in the early evening, the sky a muted grey-blue and the lamps casting long shadows across the wet cobbles. The rain had left a scent of moss and old stone in the air, and even the faint whistle of the wind seemed to carry a rhythm that demanded attention. I'd been summoned to dinner ostensibly to meet faculty and visiting scholars, but the invitation carried an undercurrent. I could not ignore a subtle suggestion that the college itself wished to observe the missing fellow through the lens of its inhabitants. I accepted the pretext, knowing that in Oxford the ordinary is rarely free of significance. The dining hall was warm with the muted glow of candlelight, the long tables gleaming, polished to a reflective sheen that caught the flicker of flames. Scholars murmured over their plates, the low hum punctuated by the subtle clinking of cutlery and the occasional cough. I noted the arrangement of seating, who lingered where, and the gesture showed a hand might hover over a glass, a moment too long, or how a student's eyes darted toward the empty chair where Coleridge should have been. Such gestures are easily overlooked, yet they often reveal as much as direct speech. Conversations unfolded in muted waves. A scholar remarked on the peculiar phrasing in a recent article, and another offered a clipped quotation from a Latin poet, slightly misremembered. I listened, allowing each nuance to linger, noting how corrections were deferred or suggested rather than stated outright. The way a person hesitates over a quotation can betray uncertainty or perhaps conceal knowledge. I jotted mental notes, small sparks of potential insight that might align later with the absence of the missing fellow. My attention was drawn to the crossword in the evening paper, left on a side table. One clue struck me in particular. Shadow conceals the smallest truth. It seemed almost a deliberate signal, a playful echo of the pattern I had begun to trace in Coleridge's routines and the anonymous letter. I noted the peculiar phrasing, the rhythm, and considered how it might metaphorically mirror the unseen gestures of those around me. In Oxford, even a trivial clue can illuminate a path when interpreted with care. I observed a visiting scholar whose gaze lingered too long on the empty chair and the way his fingers drummed on the table in irregular patterns. The dean, seated near the high end, spoke in soft tones, carefully measured, but there was a subtle edge to his emphasis, an unspoken pressure that suggested oversight rather than idle hospitality. Even the arrangement of wine glasses and folded napkins seemed imbued with intentionality, a choreography of expectation and propriety. Each movement was a line in an unspoken text that demanded quiet attention. I allowed my gaze to sweep the hall again, noting the misalignment of chairs and the slight tilt of candlesticks, the way a servant's eyes lingered on certain guests longer than others. These minor anomalies carried a cumulative weight, forming a pattern that was more impressionistic than tangible. I wondered if Coleridge had anticipated this gathering, had perhaps left a subtle mark in his absence, and whether one of these scholars was aware, knowingly or unconsciously, of his movements. As the dinner concluded, the last course cleared and the servants withdrew. I lingered near the hall's threshold, listening to the faint echo of footsteps on the polished floor. The bells from a distant tower tolled faintly, indifferent to human preoccupations, yet punctuating the rhythm of observation. I realized that the night had yielded no revelation, only the delicate layering of gestures, clues and silences, a map in shadows rather than in light. The missing fellow's presence was felt in absence, and in attending carefully, quietly, I felt the first faint pulse of understanding begin to stir. It was in the library, that dim cathedral of knowledge, that the first fragment of certainty began to coalesce. The air carried the faint tang of old parchment and polished wood, a scent that seems to anchor memory in Oxford as firmly as stone. I wandered among the stacks, noting the careful alignment of spines, the subtle wear at the corners of frequently consulted volumes, and the faint impressions left by fingers tracing words over decades. Coleridge had been a habitual visitor here, and in his absence, the traces of his presence were more pronounced than any living voice could convey. On a side table, I noticed a thin manuscript partially obscured by a larger volume of Latin treatises. The edges were uneven, as though hastily withdrawn and replaced, and a small, deliberate crease ran along one corner. I lifted it carefully and found that a single page, previously overlooked, contained a brief diary entry written in Coleridge's precise hand. The words were taut with anxiety, referencing a minor dispute over an obscure classical interpretation and a concern that someone had misread or misrepresented his conclusions. There was an urgency in the phrasing that suggested more than academic irritation, a subtle fear that only familiarity with his habits could decode. I read it twice, allowing each line to resonate. One phrase in particular caught my attention, a reference to a shadow in the aisle, an ambiguous note that might indicate a person, a circumstance, or an internal unease. The words themselves were ordinary, yet the emphasis, the careful placement of punctuation, suggested deliberation. I traced the line with a finger, noting a faint smudge of ink, as if the thought had been pressed into the page with an anxious hand. Such minutiae often betray more than overt declarations, and in Oxford, minutiae are the currency of truth. The room was nearly deserted. A porter moved silently among the shelves, and the faint creak of a floorboard punctuated the quiet. I observed a scholar whose back was turned, and I noticed the subtle tension in the shoulders, the way a hand lingered over a volume without apparent reason. Even the faint pattern of dust disturbed by the movement of feet could serve as a signal. I made note of these small details, filing them alongside my memory of the misquoted lines, the inscriptions in the quad, and the anonymous letter that had first drawn my attention. I placed the manuscript beside an open volume of classical poetry and considered the relationship between the two. Coleridge had a habit of embedding meaning through juxtaposition, drawing connections between seemingly unrelated texts. The diary page, brief as it was, hinted at a confrontation or concealment, a disturbance beneath the surface of routine scholarship. I sensed that the anonymous letter and this secret manuscript were entwined, part of a careful latticework of presence and absence that only a patient observer could pass. As I moved toward the reading desk, the bells tolled faintly, a distant punctuation of the afternoon. The windows, streaked with rain, cast long shadows across the floor, and the light caught on a faint mark along the edge of the manuscript, previously unnoticed. It suggested a code, a subtle cue, or perhaps a mere accident, but I could not dismiss it. In Oxford, even accidents often bear the weight of intent. I left the library with the manuscript in hand, mindful of the quiet tension that seemed to permeate the air. There was more to be uncovered, more to be traced in gesture and hesitation, in footfalls and glances. And in the lingering scent of ink and polished wood, I felt the first pulse of clarity, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to guide the next steps of inquiry. The missing fellow had left a shadow, and it was there, in these quiet details, that I began to see its shape. The evening had a chill that seemed to settle in the bones, the kind of cold that Oxford reserves for nights when the wind has been travelling across the Thames and the rain leaves the city damp and reflective. I walked along the narrow alleyways between colleges, my coat drawn tightly, listening to the distant toll of bells that fell unevenly, as if echoing some forgotten argument among the towers. The city was quiet in a way that invites attention, the kind that allows a subtle pattern to emerge from the ordinary hum of stone and weather. I paused outside the college gates, noting the faint disturbance of leaves against the cobbles, the way a door had swung back slightly on its hinges, creaking in time with the wind. It was a minor observation, almost irrelevant to anyone else, but such subtleties often speak in Oxford, quietly and insistently. A shadow moved across the corner of my eye, a fleeting silhouette that disappeared as soon as I focused, leaving only a lingering impression of presence. I allowed myself to imagine the absent Coleridge walking these paths, his footsteps cautious, deliberate, leaving echoes in the empty corridors. Later, as I traced the quads, I became aware of footsteps that did not belong to me, irregular and hesitant. Someone was moving with care, and yet their timing did not correspond to any ordinary round. A bent corner of a note lay near a doorway, carried there by chance or design, I could not yet determine. I picked it up, noting the faint ink smudge and the pressure that suggested urgency, and tucked it carefully into my pocket. These minor details were accumulating, forming a constellation that might, if properly interpreted, reveal the faint architecture of movement and intent. The bells rang again, more insistently this time, a rhythm that pressed upon the heart with unexpected melancholy. I stood in the misty light beneath an archway and considered the alignment of shadows, the faint footprints in mud near the library steps, and the subtle inconsistency of the porter's schedule. Each of these small observations hinted at deliberate misdirection, as though someone had rehearsed absence and presence simultaneously. Oxford, I thought, has a way of teaching one patience, of allowing truth to emerge in fragments, so that the observer becomes as engaged with the process as with the conclusion. I found my way to a familiar bench, partially hidden beneath a yew tree, and noted a faint impression in the grass, where someone had knelt or paused. It suggested a pattern of waiting, of hesitation, of observation. I considered the minor smudge on the notebook page I had retrieved earlier, the misquoted line from the previous diary entry, and the faint emphasis in the anonymous letter. In combination, they began to illuminate the contours of a story that was more movement than statement, more shadow than light. Each gesture, each hesitation, had a deliberate cadence, echoing the bells, echoing the quiet urgency of the night itself. Somewhere above, a crow winged silently between spires, its shadow fleeting across the wet stones. I followed its passage in thought, recalling the subtle hesitation of the students I had observed, the careful avoidance of certain corners, the incongruous placement of a chair in a hallway. These details, almost imperceptible, were the kind of puzzle Coleridge might have appreciated, a constellation of absence and presence, coded in gestures rather than words. I began to see not merely the course of his disappearance, but the architecture of the night in which it was embedded. By the time I returned to my rooms, damp and thoughtful, I understood that the night had revealed more than any conversation could. The bells continued their irregular toll, indifferent to observation or understanding, yet marking time in a cadence that seemed almost conspiratorial. Shadows, gestures, and echoes had combined to outline the shape of the unseen, the absent, the withheld. And in that quiet comprehension, I felt the first tremor of clarity, the awareness that Oxford itself, with its stones, its echoes, and its persistent melancholy, had begun to disclose a secret, waiting for those patient enough to observe and subtle enough to understand. The morning air carried a chill that seeped through the stone corridors, and I made my way to the series of rooms where I would speak with those who might know more than they admitted. Oxford has a way of presenting truth as if it were optional, hiding it behind cultivated manners, precise diction, and gestures rehearsed over years of polite observation. I reminded myself that each hesitation, each misquotation, each slight adjustment of a sleeve could carry more meaning than an entire lecture. My first visitor was a young scholar, one of Coleridge's protégés, who had lingered in the dining hall during the previous evening. The student spoke carefully, each phrase measured, yet his eyes betrayed an uncertainty he could not entirely conceal. He mentioned a lecture that had been cancelled, and an arrangement for private consultation, though the timeline seemed inconsistent with the porter's rounds and the librarian's recollections. I noticed a subtle shift in emphasis when he referenced a colleague's arrival, the way a scholar might obscure a detail not by falsehood, but by omission. The smallest gesture, the avoidance of direct eye contact, suggested a thought deliberately withheld. Next came a visiting fellow whose expression bore the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to scrutiny. He spoke of Coleridge's temperamental adherence to classical rigor, the occasional academic quarrel, and a particular debate that had drawn the attention of the master. I observed the way he tapped a pen against the desk, the slight curl of a lip, the careful modulation of voice. A pause before mentioning a minor dispute hinted at something deliberately veiled, a fissure between politeness and disclosure. In Oxford, one learns that silence often speaks more vividly than explanation. While reviewing these impressions, I noticed a small newspaper clipping tucked into a portfolio, edges uneven as though hurriedly pressed between papers. It contained a quotation from Shelley, truncated in a way that subtly altered its meaning. The distortion was slight, easily overlooked, yet in context it mirrored the hesitation of the scholars, the careful withholding of information. I realized that the clue was not merely in what was said, but in the small divergences between intent and utterance, the way a mind might shield truth behind cultivated patterns. A final visitor offered an anecdote about a corridor encounter the night before a shadow glimpsed through a doorway, a muffled sound of hurried movement. He laughed lightly, but the eyes betrayed awareness, a recognition that the detail was perhaps more significant than he allowed. I noted the angle of his hand on the chair, the slight tremor, the way he had adjusted a scarf without necessity. Such minutiae rarely lie. Even as he spoke of coincidence, his body suggested otherwise, hinting at knowledge of the absent Coleridge's route, or perhaps his intentions. After the last interrogation, I stepped into the rain-soaked quads, considering the aggregation of gestures, omissions, and emphases. Each visitor had left behind more than words. Subtle currents ran beneath their phrases, minor pressures of posture and voice that hinted at hidden concerns. I compared these with the inscriptions in the quads, the manuscript in the library, and the anonymous letter. A pattern began to emerge, delicate and tentative, yet persistent. Oxford's truths are seldom declared outright, often concealed in the hesitations and omissions of those who inhabit its cloisters. I returned to my rooms with the feeling of a slow accumulation of fragments assembling into a latticework of presence and absence. The bells tolled faintly in the distance, and I considered the subtlety of what had been revealed and what remained deliberately withheld. Each gesture, each inflection, each hesitation was a piece of the puzzle, and I knew that attending to these nuances would be essential in understanding not just Coleridge's disappearance, but the intricate dance of human concern, pride, and fear that had surrounded it. In the quiet aftermath of observation, I began to perceive the first outlines of intention behind absence. It was only when I returned to St. Edmund's the following morning, the quads damp with overnight rain and the spires shrouded in mist, that the first fragment of the hidden past revealed itself. I moved slowly, observing the subtle disturbances left by footsteps that did not belong to me. The slight impression of a coat dragged along the stone, the forgotten slip of paper lodged between two flagstones. These minor anomalies, easily dismissed by the unobservant, suggested a pattern, a deliberate choreography designed to obscure yet mark presence. I realized then that Coleridge's absence was not simply an event of the moment, but the culmination of a long, quiet history. In the college archives, I found a photograph carefully tucked within the pages of a catalogue of classical scholars. The image was of a younger Coleridge, seated at a seminar beside a no-retired fellow whose gaze suggested rivalry and concealed resentment. The photograph bore the faint notation of a library accession number, as though intended to be found, and yet almost overlooked by anyone else. I traced the lines of the younger men's faces, noting the subtle tension captured by the photographer, the arching eyebrows, the restrained half-smiles, the glances that avoided direct confrontation. In these details, decades-old animosities were frozen and awaiting recognition. A folded letter fell from the edge of the catalogue, its seal broken but its content intact. It referenced a misinterpreted lecture and hinted at a minor scandal, though the words were careful, almost coded. One phrase caught my attention was the suggestion that certain research had been suppressed, buried beneath the polite routines of academic propriety. I held the letter to the light, observing the indentation of the pen, the pressure that marked hesitation, and the subtle alignment that suggested a hand accustomed to concealment. The past, it seemed, had been arranging itself quietly, leaving breadcrumbs for those diligent enough to follow. I paused at the library window, listening to the faint murmur of the porters and the distant tolling of the bells. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, allowing the scent of damp stone and ink to drift in. My mind, accustomed to such atmospheres, began to trace the connections between the misquoted poetry in the anonymous letter, the subtle smudge on the manuscript, the hesitant glances of scholars, and now this archival fragment of history. The absent Coleridge was entangled not just in the present moment, but in a latticework of rivalries, pride, and concealed knowledge that had persisted for years. I returned to the quads to examine once more the elm under which I had previously noticed the carved inscription. The line of letters, misquoted, now seemed less trivial, less whimsical. It was a signpost linking past to present. I observed the wear of the bench, the uneven stone beneath, and the faint impression of footprints that suggested repeated visits. Someone had been revisiting these sites, perhaps retracing steps, perhaps arranging the scene with care. The hidden past, I realized, was both a record and a stage, a deliberate environment into which Coleridge's absence was now woven. A crow passed overhead, its wings casting, fleeting shadows, and I felt the subtle tension of recognition that the past is never truly absent. It lingers, echoing in gestures, inscriptions, and small misdirections. The faint impression of an old library ledger page, a forgotten annotation in a thesis, the subtle rivalry frozen in a photograph all pointed toward a culmination that the present had merely begun to acknowledge. As I left the quad, the bells tolled softly, indifferent yet haunting, and I understood that the hidden past was more than context. It was motive, it was a map, and it was a mirror of human flaw pressed against the city's stone. Patience and observation would reveal the final contours of Coleridge's absence, yet even then I knew some shadows would remain, unclaimed, waiting in the quiet intervals of memory and the spaces between echoes. I remember that afternoon with a peculiar clarity, as though each step through the quads was measured not by distance, but by the sequence of revelation. The rain had paused, leaving the stone slick and reflective, and the muted light allowed shadows to linger with a strange insistence. I moved slowly, aware of every subtle irregularity, the tilt of a chair, the faint smudge along a windowsill, the nearly imperceptible shift in the air where a door had been left ajar. These minor perturbations were often the loudest signals, if one had the patience to read them. I returned to the library, where the manuscript and diary fragments had been quietly resting. The diagonal crease on the diary page now seemed less incidental, a mark left deliberately to highlight a particular lineal-veiled allusion to a meeting, an argument, a moment of hesitation captured in ink. I compared it with the anonymous letter and the misquoted poetry, tracing the thematic echoes. There was a careful architecture to absence, a deliberate orchestration of misdirection, and it was here, in these small repetitions and mirrored gestures, that clarity began to stir. The porter had left his rounds slightly altered that day, a minor deviation that in ordinary circumstances would mean nothing, but in the context of the observed patterns, it suggested prior knowledge or collusion. I noted the precise times recorded in the ledger, the slight overlap of duties, and the sequence of footfalls that could be reconstructed from the impressions on wet stone. Each minor inconsistency was a thread, and I began to see how they wove together a picture of Coleridge's movements or of the actions designed to obscure them. I considered the scholars I had interrogated, recalling subtle inflections, gestures, and the way each had avoided or emphasized certain details. A hesitation here, a glimmer of recognition there, the misplacement of a pen, the involuntary adjustment of a scarf. These were the small rhythms of deception, and in assembling them, I found the faint outline of opportunity, motive, and restraint. The puzzle had not changed in principle, only in the accumulation of detail, the slow crystallization of pattern from ambiguity. As the afternoon waned, I traced once more the route along the quads and the empty corridors, noting the echo of my own steps against the polished stone. The footprints of others were faint but discernible, a narrative in shadow, mapping absence with surprising precision. I paused beneath the elm, observing the carved inscription once again, now illuminated by a shaft of low sunlight. The missing syllable in the line, the deliberate misquote, the small smudge on the adjacent cobbles were all signals pointing toward an intersection of past grievance and present misdirection. I allowed myself to review the chronology quietly, folding together fragments from letters, diaries, and minor gestures. The anonymous note, the disrupted chair in the dining hall, the hesitant repetition of a quotation all began to align, producing an outline of events that was almost invisible in its subtlety. No dramatic confrontation, no overt confession. Rather, the pattern revealed itself in the rhythm of routine, the distortions of careful scholarship, the slight deviations in human behavior under observation. By evening, as the bells tolled faintly from a distant tower, I felt the quiet unraveling settling around me. The narrative was clear enough to proceed, but remained delicate, intricate, and morally complex. Coleridge's absence was a cipher written in gesture, in omission, in the faint traces of intent pressed against stone, wood, and paper. To untangle it was not to conclude with certainty, but to perceive the structure that had long been in place, the interplay of human pride, error, and subtle design. And in that stillness, I understood that the resolution would emerge not with fanfare, but with the same quiet insistence that had allowed the pattern to exist unnoticed until now. It was late afternoon when the final pieces of the puzzle began to coalesce. The quads bathed in a soft, diffused light that made the wet stones shimmer like polished glass. The bells tolled in the distance, their sound irregular, as though skipping a note in deference to something unseen. I moved deliberately through the corridors, retracing the paths I had observed over the previous days, noting the slight misalignments in furniture, the faint impressions in the stone, and the subtle residue of ink and dust left by hurried hands. Everything now seemed to speak with clarity, though the language was quiet and understated. I began with the diary fragments, placing them beside the anonymous letter and the misquoted manuscript, allowing the echoes of language and intent to interact. The pressure of the pen, the choice of words, the small creases were all deliberate, marking moments, gestures, and warnings. I realized that the absent Coleridge had left a trail not of fear, but of subtle provocation, of intellectual challenge designed to draw observation and elicit response. In essence, he had orchestrated his own absence as a series of signposts, and the key lay in interpreting them with patience. The scholars I had questioned came to mind, each inflection, each hesitation, each adjusted glance now forming part of the lattice of behavior. One of them had been precise in everything except a single overlooked gesture, the curling of a finger when mentioning the timing of a lecture, the slight hesitation before naming a particular colleague. It was that minor inconsistency, seemingly trivial in isolation, that revealed the alignment of motive and opportunity. In Oxford, where intellect is cultivated and gestures are disciplined, it is often the minutiae that betray intent. I walked the quads again, noting the alignment of shadows and the faint impressions left on the stone by hurried passage. The bench beneath the elm, the carved inscription, the mud smudge, each was a deliberate marker. I traced the chronology in my mind, folding past quarrels, archival photographs, and subtle rivalries into a coherent, though morally complex, sequence. Coleridge's disappearance, it seemed, was less a result of violence than the culmination of long-simmering tensions, intellectual pride, and careful manipulation. The absence had been designed to reveal character as much as circumstance. I found the scholar whose gestures had betrayed him and allowed the quiet confrontation to unfold, not with accusation, but with observation and reflection. He admitted, almost reluctantly, the series of minor deceptions and deliberate oversights that had been intended to protect, to obscure, or perhaps to manipulate understanding. There was no grand confession, no dramatized revelation, only the acknowledgement that the past and present were inextricably intertwined, and that human ambition and fear often shape events more decisively than any single act. By the time I returned to the archway overlooking the quads, the bells tolled again, slower now, carrying a melancholy cadence. The rain had ceased, leaving the city glistening in a reflective quiet. I paused to consider the resolution, not in terms of justice or morality, but as the completion of a sequence of observation and deduction. The narrative was clear, the human motives coherent, yet the emotional truth remained layered, complex, unresolved, characteristic Oxford resolution, elegant and unsettling in its restraint. As I walked back toward my rooms, the fading light caught on the spires and the wet stone, and I understood that the absence of Coleridge had taught lessons beyond detection. The persistence of subtlety, the eloquence of minor gestures, the endurance of history pressing upon the present. Even in resolution, Oxford preserved ambiguity, and the quiet that followed the bells carried both closure and the faint ache of recognition. There was, and always would be, a shadow between knowledge and understanding, and in that space the city whispered its secrets to those patient enough to listen. The evening settled over Oxford like a sigh, the sky washed in shades of grey and amber, the last light pooling on the wet cobbles with the quiet insistence of memory. I walked slowly through the quads, each step measured, allowing the city to unfold around me as one might leaf through an old manuscript. The rain had ceased, leaving the air cool and faintly fragrant with damp stone and ancient mortar. The bells tolled softly in the distance, each note both a punctuation and an echo, marking not merely the hour, but the rhythm of observation and reflection. I paused beneath the elm where the carved inscription had first caught my attention. The letters, faint but deliberate, seemed to absorb the dim light and hold it, as though Oxford itself had consented to reveal a fragment of its secret. The impressions of footsteps, the subtle smudges of ink and mud, the neglected scrap of paper lodged beneath a flagstone, all these minor details, once separate, now assembled into a narrative of absence, presence, and quiet intention. Coleridge's disappearance and the interplay of human pride, fear, and scholarly ambition that surrounded it had been rendered legible in the careful tracing of these faint marks. I thought of the scholars I had observed, the subtle inflections, the gestures that had betrayed knowledge without declaration. Their hesitations, the misquoted lines, the avoidance of certain topics, all had formed a lattice of subtle truth. The anonymous letter, the misaligned chair, the diary fragment and its folded corners were not merely curiosities but signposts, each placed with care, each intended to guide those patient enough to perceive them. In Oxford, such attention to nuance is both the privilege and the burden of the observant. Passing through the empty corridors, I noted the faint creak of floorboards and the soft echo of doors swinging against their hinges. Shadows stretched along the walls, bending in the uneven light, and I allowed myself to imagine Coleridge retracing these very paths, leaving intentional traces that spoke more than words could. The architecture, the atmosphere, the cadence of footfalls, all were witnesses, recording presence and absence in a medium older and more durable than speech. I paused by a window, watching the mist gather over the river, the lights reflecting as if in an impressionist painting. In the distance, a crow passed between spires, its wings casting fleeting shadows. I reflected that even in resolution, Oxford preserves ambiguity. Closure is never absolute, and understanding often arrives as an echo, a whisper between the lines of observation. The city teaches patience, restraint, and the subtle art of noticing, reminding one that even the most meticulous pattern contains interstices where mystery lingers. The bells tolled again, slowly, insistently, as if to remind me that time moves forward whether comprehension follows or not. I drew a deep breath of the damp, fragrant air, and felt the quiet satisfaction of having traced absence to its faint architecture without needing to impose artificial clarity upon it. The city, with its stones and shadows, had revealed enough. The narrative, delicate and morally complex, was settled in its own terms, and I walked toward my rooms, carrying the subtle weight of observation, the faint ache of insight, and the enduring knowledge that in Oxford some questions remain, quietly, between the tolls of the bells.